Hello there, listeners, and welcome to the Fourth Realm. I'm your host, the Iron Defender, and today we're going to be taking a look at the experiment for what it really is meant to be. A social experiment. For those of you who have forgotten, the general premise of the experiment was that everyone would be forced to share a single base together and would all have to live on the same island. This was the general area that the experiment took place in. Furthermore, however, items also would need to be shared, and people were forced to live, share, and work together. And the general idea was testing what would happen if that occurred. As some additional caveats, though, we added things such as limited lives, since in a previous social experiment I did, which was before this YouTube channel got started, there was a lot of constant infighting in PvP due to the fact that there was no real cost of dying or doing so, and, angst. So we had a limited system of lives so that if you were to try and go do reckless things, there would be consequences. Furthermore, it made death more permanent. But we didn't want only one life, since people might die very quickly in the early days, and this could lead them being knocked out of the series, leading to a very short series, so we ended up choosing a number of 3 lives. Additionally, we added the feature of ostracization, which was meant to act as a sort of Hail Mary and also a punishment to those who did wrong, but only if the society chose to do so. Before we get started, however, there is one thing I want to mention, and that's a question that might come up. Was the experiment scripted? The answer? Yes, but only for one part. Basically, to explain, during the first half of episode 10, the video and audio footage got corrupted, and we couldn't use it. So we ended up redoing the whole thing almost exactly as it happened, since with Tora dying and the sort of civil war beginning, we felt that was way too important to miss out on, and we couldn't just let that slide. So that part is scripted. However, the rest of it is actually not scripted, at least not as a whole. Although a lot of people did sort of make their own personal scripts or agendas. I know in particular, Mizo and Torakat worked heavily together in the weeks in between sessions, planning out what they were going to do and the sort of theatrics they wanted to do. And some of the other members, like Potato and Axtraz, were nice and played along with their theatrics, which I thought was very fun to watch. But, if anything, that's more so speaks to the experiment itself, since they themselves organized these things without me really needing to do anything. So that was something I found interesting. So I'm going to start off first with some of the things I thought were wrong or flawed with the experiment from the actual social experiment standpoint. First off, and probably the biggest, the limited number of people. With only 6 people on the experiment, that really meant we didn't get the same kind of results as if it were a larger group. And especially since all of us are actual good friends, it's made it so we were less likely to, I guess, be divided with one another. Furthermore, the limited number of people made it so that if anything happened to any single person, then, well, that drastically affected the experiment, like with Axtraz going to prison. Now, we did try to resolve this by inviting a lot of people, but only about a little under half actually ended up accepting and ended up joining the experiment. So that was definitely one major flaw. Another flaw was exterior influences, namely Last Life. Last Life with the whole Red Lives thing, and since a lot of us were watching at the time, it influenced the behavior of the people who went red, me included, I admit. And that did mess with the experiment a little bit, but I'll get in more detail into that later. Some other caveats were also definitely missing the first episode of recording due to the fact that my recording software wasn't working, which wasn't really something I could control, but that was actually by far one of the most eventful weeks up until the finale, so it's quite a bummer that we missed that. And another thing was definitely people not being able to attend sessions every time, namely Axtraz, who missed a lot of the sessions despite being a very important character. And although we tried to alleviate this, we missed even many weeks trying to get more people on. It was still a major problem, and this massively skewed with the results of the experiment. But now for the stuff that I liked about the experiment, I thought was very interesting about the experiment. Namely, leadership. I wasn't really sure if people were gonna go for a path of electing a leader, especially with a society so small. So I was very interested to see that we did, and nearly unanimously elected Potato. Although for, people who watch the series all the way through, that didn't end well. Another thing I thought was interesting was how people spread out on the island. I was unsure if they would spread out thinly across the island and want to live far away from each other, or if they'd all live near each other. But surprisingly, we all lived very close by to each other, which I definitely think a big reason for that was the sheer lack of people and how infrequently people are online. Plus, once we lit up the valley area, there wasn't really any incentive to leave it, since you'd just be going out into the wilderness to die, basically. Some people, like Potato and Mizo, did leave, but the majority of people, like Rapolhomi and Axe, lived in the valley, and then there was Tora, who just mined the entire series. Another thing I found interesting that sort of developed was, life classism. People with red lives sort of got a superiority complex and began bullying all the other people with lower amounts of lives, trying to egg them on to join them. I guess the thrill being the red life, and also influences from Last Life, like I said earlier, definitely contributed to that. That was definitely an interesting thing, though. And then, of course, there was the main thing in the experiment, sharing items, which basically didn't happen. Although we had a lot of community storage and people did contribute and take items as they needed, for the most part, human greed continued to do its best, and very few people shared items. A lot of people consolidated resources from themselves, especially Potato and Toracat. Potato in particular, because he consolidated all those potions for his plot to burn it all down. And Toracat, to be fair, he did a lot of his mining, but he also kept the mentality of, if I worked for it, it should be mine. And I guess none of us opposed that enough. So, yeah, that's another interesting thing about the experiment, was enforcement. I was interested to see if they would try to enforce the policy of shared items, or if that would sort of be laissez-faire, I guess. And it went a little bit in the enforcement, but really not that much. For the most part, people got to keep their own stuff. If you worked for it, it was considered yours, especially if you died for it, like Potato for his 2 netherite ingots. Now for the actual part on analogies. How does this apply to the real world? Or does it apply to the real world at all? If there's one thing, I guess, with Potato's sort of arc, if you could call it that, it's that, power corrupts. Basically, we gave him power, he had it all, he had all the resources, the netherite, everything, and he ended up being the one to go evil and just break it all down. And if there's anything we can really learn from this experiment, boredom is the greatest driving factor of all of humanity. If I'm being fully honest, I don't think there's too much to take away from this, given that it was a fairly small social experiment and not the most well thought out from a social experiment perspective. But it was very fun to do. I highly enjoyed it. I know that a lot of the other people who were part of the experiment enjoyed it, and we would all definitely be looking forward to the possibility of doing another experiment in the future, although no promises. So then, dear listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this series just as much as I did, and I hope that you will enjoy some of my future content as well with the Resurrection SMP. And with that all out of the way, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.